The man known to posterity as King Henry I of England was born in around 1068 or 69, the only son of William the Conqueror to actually be born in England, and to the Conqueror while he was king. Henry was born just a few years after the tumultuous events of the initial Norman conquest. His early months likely spent touring a devastated north with his father's household in retaliation for one of the many rebellions against Norman rule. This particularly nasty episode of the conquest, known to history as the Harrying of the North. Henry was possibly born in the town of Selby, Yorkshire, but despite this distinction of English birth, was at his core still a Norman, his world centred across the Channel, in his family's ancestral domain. It is highly likely that Queen Matilda, Henry's mother, named her younger son for a royal uncle, Henry I, King of France. Henry would have been granted the education befitting a prince, with a focus on martial training and skill, though interestingly, one of his nicknames was Henry Beauclerc, or Good Scholar, given his fluency in Latin and general interest in reading. It's possible that, being a younger son, he was also destined for the church. Physically, the boy would grow to resemble the Conqueror's other sons Robert, Richard, and William, being short, stocky, and barrel-chested, with a head of black hair. As a younger son, not much is known about Henry's upbringing, or even location during the first decades of life, with scholars divided on whether he was primarily brought up in England or Normandy. Henry truly entered into the political mainstream following his father's demise at the age of 60 on September 9, 1087. It appears that his father followed Norman inheritance customs by allowing his rebellious son Robert his inheritance of Normandy, given the Conqueror himself had inherited this. However, the Kingdom of England had been won by him through war, and was thus open to be appointed to whomever he wished. William's tenure as king had been far from cosy, having numerous rebellions to quell in England, but also a rebellion by his own son Robert to squash. In 1077, an incident in which both William Rufus and Henry allegedly emptied a chamber pot over their elder brother's head was the trigger for Robert's rebellion and exile. Henry's other elder brother, William Rufus, fought on the side of his father and remained loyal throughout his reign, which probably helped inform King William's later decision, which widened the rift between brothers even further. In 1079, Robert engaged his father in battle directly, wounding the younger William and even unhorsing his father. Accounts differ, with one stating that the aging king was rescued by an accompanying Englishman who gave up his horse, with another suggesting that Robert himself recognized his father's voice and allowed him to escape. The king, however, would likely not have forgotten this humiliation, which was compounded when he later found out that Robert had been financed by the Queen, straining an otherwise loving and close relationship between husband and wife. A reconciliation was brokered in 1080, but Robert could have been under no illusion that his actions had permanently blackened him in his father's eyes. Given this context then, it's no great surprise that the dying King William designated his middle surviving son, William, as his successor in England, while Robert finally succeeded his birthright in Normandy. As for Henry, he received no lands, yet was compensated with £5,000 and a vague promise that he would eventually receive his mother's lands in Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire. Henry, however, ruthless and ambitious, was certainly his father's son, and not willing to settle for such a measly inheritance. Henry was not the only brother who fundamentally disagreed with their father's decision, as Robert returned to Normandy, having left court soon after his mother's death in 1083, and fully expected to inherit both the duchy and the kingdom. Some barons in England agreed, with the Conqueror's two half-brothers Odo and Robert throwing their support behind the elder son. This rebellion of 1088 was soon suppressed by the new king, with Duke Robert failing to effectively appear. Henry himself experienced what would become a hard reality for all the Norman aristocracy who held lands on both sides of the Channel. Initially, he quietly remained loyal to Robert, perhaps fearful that his brother may try to steal his inheritance money the attempted flight. Robert requested the money anyway, but Henry refused, instead coming to a compromise and purchasing the rights to the lands of the Cotentin. Henry was recognised as the Count of Cotentin in exchange for £3,000, but his time under his brother's watch would not be comfortable. Henry did manage to cement his hold on the west of the duchy by forging a strong network of baronial support, so that by the time Robert's attempt to take England by force had failed, and he attempted to go back on the deal with Henry, Henry's grip was solid. Unlike his younger brothers, Duke Robert was not, it seems, an effective ruler, his duchy falling into chaos, a situation taken advantage of by Henry, who effectively ruled as an independent lord in the west of Normandy. Henry's position, however, was precarious. Travelling to England soon after the failure of the 1088 rebellion, his request for his mother's lands was refused by Rufus, perhaps as punishment for his outward loyalty to Robert. What's more, Henry was seized soon after, back in Normandy, by one of Robert's chief supporters, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and imprisoned. Henry remained incarcerated over the winter of 1088, but was released in early 1089. Robert had taken the opportunity to seize back the Cotentin. Despite this, Henry's support was strong enough for him to maintain effective de facto control over western Normandy, even if he was no longer officially the Count. The war of his brothers continued, with Rufus too outmatching Robert as a politician by fostering baronial support within the duchy itself and in Ponthieu next door. Robert bolstered his own support with an alliance with Philip I, King of France. In 1090, Henry demonstrated his ruthlessness. Rufus made his move by prompting Robert's vassal in Normandy, Conan Palatus, to rebel, which he did, attempting to seize the capital of Rouen. This latest threat was serious, given most of the city supported Conan, and he had appealed to neighbouring garrisons for support. Henry answered his liege's call for support, arriving in Rouen first in November. The ensuing struggle was bitter and bloody, with street-by-street fighting consuming the area. Duke Robert joined his younger brother in attempting to suppress the rebels, but chose to retreat from the action, leaving Henry to fight on alone. Yet Henry overcame Conan's men and seized the burgher himself. Henry then had the unfortunate Conan dragged to the top of Rouen Castle, where despite offers of a large ransom, he had him thrown off to his death. Despite this brutal demonstration of loyalty, it's possible Duke Robert was threatened by Henry's victory, as soon after he ordered Henry to leave the city, though it could also have been due to Henry's request for official reinstatement as the Count of Cotentin. 1091 saw King William Rufus himself invade the duchy with a large enough army to force Robert to cede lands to him in exchange for his aid in retaking lost territory in Maine. Rufus also agreed to help Robert solidify control over his duchy, including those quasi-independent areas under Henry. Henry was also effectively excluded politically, given both his elder brothers recognised each other as their heir. Unable to play one brother against the other, Henry was forced to take up arms, marshalling his baronial network in the Cotentin region. However, this support soon crumbled, and he moved west to besiege the strategic fortress of Mont Saint-Michel. This ambitious move failed too, causing Henry's exile into Brittany and then France for a time. Orderic Vitalis suggests Henry spent the year lingering in the Vexin and other border regions with a small clique of followers. Henry may have been biding his time, as eventually the pact between Robert and William dissolved. 1092, Henry seized upon a golden opportunity to re-establish his local power base. The people of Domfront, tiring of the rule of Robert of Bellême, invited Henry and his supporters to take the town, which they did in a swift and non-violent coup. Over the next 2 years, Henry built up another network of support in the west, even securing the support of Rufus and using funds received from him to construct a formidable castle in Domfront itself. With himself established as a rival power in the duchy, Henry began regularly visiting England and his royal brother's court, openly supporting the Red King. As with 1087, the year of 1095 saw a decisive shift in Henry's fortunes, as Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, which Duke Robert enthusiastically joined, though he needed funding. As King of England, his brother William had the tax base and resources to oblige. For a price, Robert mortgaged his duchy to William for a sum of 10,000 marks. Robert's departure thus removed a dangerous rival. Realizing what way the winds of history were blowing, Henry doubled down on his support for Rufus, campaigning with him in the Vexin region during the years 1097 and 98. Yet, if 1087 and 1095 were significant years in the life of Henry Beauclerc, then 1100 would prove his golden breakthrough. On a fine summer's day, on August 2nd, the King of England, William Rufus, stalked through the New Forest. The king, however, was not alone. Within his party happens to be his younger brother Henry, and the day is about to decisively darken. The hush of the hunt is suddenly shattered by a shriek of pain, but it's no beast's cry that echoes through this secluded part of the New Forest. The king staggers, clutching his chest, before sinking slowly at the foot of a tree, his royal blood staining the bark as he falls. For Henry, the time is very convenient. The arrow shot had come from within his own party. Later sources suggest Walter Tyrrell as the killer. Whether conspiracy or clumsiness, it hardly mattered to Henry. He moved quickly, as did his noble companions, quickly fleeing the body of the king and scattering to secure their holdings. Henry's haste was understandable. The rules of succession to the English throne were hardly set in stone. Henry's father, the Conqueror, had seized the throne in 1066, but it had been his second-born, William, who had claimed the kingship following his own death through his explicit preference. Robert still lived and had a strong claim given the old Treaty of Rouen, in which they had made each other their heir. Henry, however, begged to differ, and with Robert safely out of the way, returning from crusade, he rushed to the ancient city of Winchester to take possession of the royal treasury, before making his way to London and having himself crowned king in near record time. It was this singular act that sealed the deal. It's important to note that for the Normans the act of coronation itself was what ended the interregnum period between the death and accession of the monarch. Unlike their Anglo-Saxon predecessors who acclaimed their kings, for the Normans the anointing and formal crowning was what completed the transformation. It was a sacred act, it was the divine act of approval, and, as such, could not easily be undone. Indeed, by the time Robert Curthose had landed in England in July of 1101, Henry's takeover was all but a fait accompli. Robert was persuaded to accept his younger brother's accession, with only the shaky acknowledgement that he was to be recognised as Henry's heir, and vice versa he to Robert's duchy, if neither produced a male heir, as well as a yearly tribute to Robert. That a similar arrangement had existed between Robert and Rufus probably did not help to placate Robert, given that agreement had arguably been far more meaningful. William was unmarried and had no heir. There was only 5 or so years between them in age. King Henry's wife, however, was already pregnant, and even if this failed, he would go on to father many bastard children. Robert returned to Normandy, where he celebrated the arrival of his son, William, in October of 1102. King Henry's wife, Matilda, originally christened Edith, had also given birth to another Matilda, the king's only legitimate daughter, in February of 1102, with his own son, another William, arriving in the summer of 1103. Henry was too smart of a politician, however, to simply rely on force of arms alone to back his crown. His speed had necessitated his crowning by the Bishop of London, rather than by one of England's archbishops. Anselm was absent in exile, and Henry had clearly not wished to risk waiting on Thomas, Archbishop of York, to travel south. Henry tried to reason, somewhat successfully, after Rufus's fall that, unlike Robert, he was actually born to a reigning monarch, thus claiming the crown through right of porphyrogeniture. Henry gained the support of Henry de Beaumont and Robert of Milan, which seems to have tipped the balance with the barons reluctantly supporting him. Henry further strengthened his hold by issuing a charter perceiving the unpopularity of his brother's regime, in which he overtaxed the barons. Rufus had been particularly unpopular with the church for his practice not appointing clergy to vacated church posts, keeping the revenues for himself. Rufus's relations with the church had deteriorated to the point of exiling Anselm. Henry positioned himself as the reformer to his evil brother. Henry proclaimed that the money-making practices of his brother and father were to be discontinued, including making baronial successors pay for their inheritance, blocking marriages between nobles, and cancelling debts owed to Rufus, among other grievances. These concessions went a long way to placating the church and the barons, but Henry was also king of a relatively hostile population of Anglo-Saxons. It had only been 34 years since the Battle of Hastings, and there were likely many people still alive who fought against Henry's father there. The larger population were also hostile to the succession. However, Henry was not blind to this aspect to the securing of his succession. On November 11th of the same year, he married Edith, daughter of the King of Scots. Edith, who changed her name to the more Norman Matilda, was no ordinary noble lady. She was in fact the daughter of Margaret of Wessex, Queen of Malcolm III of Scotland. Margaret was a direct descendant of King Alfred the Great, being a scion of the true Anglo-Saxon line of kings, thus making her daughter Edith of English royal blood too. Her mother was the daughter of Edward the Exile, the son of King Edmund Ironside, the Anglo-Saxon warrior king who fought Canute in a series of battles way back 1015 to 16. This match would thus ensure that any children sired would share the royal blood of both William the Conqueror and, more importantly, the native House of Wessex. This proved popular with the native English, though was generally frowned upon by the Norman elite. Henry had nonetheless achieved a stability with the match and would continue to cement his crown with another key marriage alliance later on. With both brothers siring legitimate sons, any mutual succession agreement was dead in the water. Interestingly, perhaps tellingly, the sobriquets given to both Williams indicate the continuing ambition of both fathers. Robert's William, known as Clito, which derives from the Latin Incletus, and Henry's son, known as Atheling, a Norman-French corruption of the Anglo-Saxon Atheling, with both roughly translating as kingworthy or of royal blood. But despite these royal ambitions on the part of his son, Duke Robert had far more immediate problems in his duchy, with his magnates factionalized in petty disputes. It deteriorated to the point that some of these powerful men began appealing to Henry across the Channel. Henry was not immune from continued internal dissent himself, and although he had brought several key men from his brother's regime into his own, he had imprisoned the unpopular Bishop of Durham, Ranulph Flambard, in the Tower of London. In 1101, Flambard escaped and began scheming with Robert in Normandy. Many of the Norman elite in England were also shaky in their allegiance, or openly supportive of Robert as king. Henry moved with Anselm's support to deprive Flambard of his bishopric, and moved to Pevensey to contest an expected landing of Robert's army. Alarmingly, though many English levies and knights joined Henry here, many barons were conspicuously absent. Despite the lack of support and Robert's unexpected landing further down the coast in Portsmouth on July 20th, the Duke did not move quickly to seize Henry's treasury at Winchester. This dithering allowed Henry to intercept him and his host. It was at this point that the two men met at Alton, agreeing the vacuous treaty in which Robert released Henry from his oath of fealty and recognised him as king, if Henry in turn gave up his claims to western Normandy and pledged his aid in Normandy. This was also the agreement that stipulated the mutual succession of either to the other's lands if either died. However, Prince William's birth in 1103 obviously made Robert's succession to Henry null and void. Henry was not idle in punishing those barons who had sided with his brother, notably banishing Robert of Bouillon in 1102, forcing him and his brothers to flee to Duke Robert. Henry was also busy in other ways too, famously fathering many illegitimate children before and during his marriage to Matilda. As many as 9 sons and 13 daughters were sired, 2 of which he used to forge marriage links with nobles in Normandy in 1103. Robert's position continued to deteriorate, with his duchy falling into factionalism and chaos, nobles splitting between pro-Henry and pro-Robert factions in open warfare. Henry landed a sizable force in November of 1105. He managed to take over a significant portion of western Normandy, capturing Bayeux and Caen, but halted due to problems back home concerning the investiture controversy. This gave Robert precious breathing space. In the early summer of 1106, King Henry landed again near Caen and began where he had left off by building on his earlier conquests, persuading more of Robert's lords to join him. Robert, by contrast, was losing control of his duchy and felt driven to act. He was informed that his brother was besieging the castle of Tinchebray, and so moved to confront him there. Robert arrived in the area close to Henry's host by late September, and the two hosts encamped a decent distance apart. Unlike at Alton, however, talks broke down, with Henry maybe feeling he had a superior position. He thus refused to abandon the siege. Left with little choice, Robert had to act to retain his power in the duchy, with a pitched battle the only decisive way to stymie his royal brother's ascent. The Duke divided his army into 2 lines, consisting of Norman cavalry and supporting foot. Robert of Bouillon headed the ducal reserve and was given the discretion of attacking at the key moment. King Henry divided his army into 3 lines, with the Earls of Leicester and Surrey commanding the 2 main groups. Henry, knowing he had more of the crucial cavalry, did not want to squander this opportunity of battle by giving his brother the advantage of a defensive posture. He wanted Robert to attack. With this in mind, Henry ordered his mounted knights in the main lines to dismount and fight on foot, thus giving Robert the illusion of mounted superiority. Importantly, however, Henry held back a significant reserve of knights in the 3rd group on his flank under Elias of Maine. The ruse worked, and it was Robert who initiated hostilities, ordering his first line to attack, smashing loudly into Henry's awaiting knights. The fighting then devolved into a bloody slugging match, with Robert's mounted knights beginning to pressure Henry's dismounted knights. However, though close to losing its cohesiveness, the royal lines held, with support from some infantry reserves. Acting quickly, knowing that this balance in force could not hold, it was the king who seized back the initiative and ordered his hidden mounted reserve to attack Robert's flank. Elias thundered out from his deep cover and smashed into Robert's unprotected flank, surprising the bloodied and spent knights of his first line. Despite this shock, all was not lost if Robert's ally and commander of his second line now charged to his aid as was planned, and thus turned the tide of the battle. Yet Robert of Bouillon did not oblige to the Duke's likely horror. Bouillon may have seen such an act as a lost cause and instead fled the field, leaving Robert to his fate. This treachery was the decisive moment leading to the total collapse of morale in Robert's infantry, which routed, leaving the Duke and his knights locked into a deadly battle for life, only to be surrounded, killed, and in many cases captured. Robert himself fought bravely and was taken along with William, Count of Mortain, and Edgar Atheling, the uncle of King Henry's wife. This battle was a turning point in Henry's reign, definitively sealing his control of both his father's kingdom and duchy, uniting the domains for the first time since 1087. His brother was sent back to England in irons, where he would spend the remaining years of his long life in prison. Despite Duke Robert's capture and incarceration, his son William Clito was spared immediately after events, an uncharacteristic mistake that would prove costly to the security of Henry's rule. Henry spent the next few years consolidating his rule, continuing to groom his only son and heir, William Atheling, to be his eventual successor. Meanwhile, opposition to Henry in Normandy did not collapse following Tinchebray, but merely coalesced around Duke Robert's son, William Clito. Meanwhile, Henry proved a good ruler, travelling extensively with his court around England and Normandy to enact justice. His justice was a fought-for revision of his father's famed ruthlessness. Henry clamped down on those found guilty, debasing the coinage by inflicting harsh corporal punishments. Many appointees to his government were also new men of relatively low stock, likely a deliberate attempt to bind such men closer to him, rather than having disloyal, established men around him. It is in Henry's reign that the office of Chancellor of the Exchequer derives, which is still in use today. The Exchequer was simply the table used to calculate taxes and goods. A practice began in Henry's time, given its first mention in royal writ in 1110. Roger of Salisbury had begun to develop the Royal Exchequer around this time, using it to collect and audit revenues from the king's sheriffs in the shires. Henry's borders in England were also secure, with relations with the Scots being generally good. Henry also maintained decent relations with the native Welsh princes, while encouraging march or incursion deeper into southern Wales. Normandy too was settled under Henry's rule, kept stable through complex interlocking relations with native families, as well as strong castles within the border regions and alliances with notable families in the border counties. Henry's relations with the church were a mixed bag. Though the church was vital to the smooth running of his administration, the investiture controversy proved a major thorn in his realm's stability. Pope Urban II decreed in 1099 that bishops should only receive the ceremonial ring and staff, or investiture, from the papacy, and not by kings, which was traditionally the case. As a fan of royal symbolism, given his own shaky claim to the crown, Henry was reluctant to give way, though also wary, pre-Tinchebray, of alienating church support while contesting Robert. Henry could not budge Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, from his support of the Pope's stance, and the latter fled England, with the king seizing his lands, and the former threatening excommunication, which would do serious damage to Henry's credibility. By July 1105, however, Henry proved his political acumen by negotiating a compromise with the Archbishop, that though he could not invest bishops, he would require them to pay homage to him for those lands they held. Henry's charm and power were clearly enough to placate Anselm enough for the latter to vociferously support his new king during Robert's invasion of 1101, something that would have been unthinkable with William Rufus, his predecessor. Henry also had the misfortune of presiding over a dispute between the premier posts of the English Church, with a dispute over the primacy between the archbishoprics of Canterbury and York. Henry continued to play a major part in the selection of bishops and worked to ensure the installation of a wider range of these men into roles as advisors, thus distancing himself with the prickly archbishops. On a larger scale, the threat to Henry's dominion was exacerbated by the rise to the French throne of Louis the Fat, king with ambitions to extend direct royal authority over the patchwork of nominal vassals that was his kingdom. The French monarchs did not rule much beyond a small strip of land around Paris, and Louis wanted to change that. Henry obviously denied this, so the two men met on the Franco-Norman border in 1109 to settle the dispute. In the event, no fighting took place, with Louis actually achieving little. The castles guarding the road from Paris to Rouen still remained in Henry's possession, and the King of England even strengthened his position by forging an alliance with Brittany on his western border and having Louis formally recognise his suzerainty over Maine to his south. By 1115, however, Henry's project of dynastic security, so carefully cultivated since the start of his reign, was unravelling before his eyes. Despite his gains, Henry still needed the recognition of Louis if his line were to be secure in their holdings. Having installed his son William as his successor in Normandy as Duke was not enough, as his nominal overlord, with the support of the Count of Flanders, elected to back William Clito, the son of the previous Duke, Henry's brother Robert Curthose, who still languished in captivity back in England. In the next years, the situation deteriorated for Henry, with border skirmishes devolving into a defensive campaign, as he not only faced Louis raiding his own border, but also the efforts of Baldwin of Flanders, the patron of Clito, and Fulk of Anjou to the south, who even inflicted a defeat on him at Alençon. This defeat inflamed the opposition to Henry from Norman nobles, which required his deeper involvement in local politics, even to the detriment of important events. Indeed, Henry was too busy in Normandy to even attend the funeral of his queen, Matilda, in 1118. This campaign and his political efforts did, however, begin to pay off. Luckily, Baldwin of Flanders succumbed to wounds in the summer of 1118, temporarily granting Henry respite on this front. He also arranged the marriage of William, his son, to the daughter of Fulk, Count of Anjou, in the spring of 1119. Fulk also permanently departed the area for the Holy Land to take up the title King of Jerusalem, thus removing this threat from the south and even leaving Maine back under Henry's effective control. With matters temporarily calmed, the king now assembled around 500 knights and headed back to raiding the French borderlands. It was here that Henry learned of a French incursion in the same area. Such an opportunity was hard to dismiss, and Henry moved his contingent to the stockade farmstead of Bremule, which straddled the old Roman road and had a thick, wooded area nearby. Louis quickly realised that Henry was close and moved to meet him to settle their dispute. Having slightly less knights at around 400 men, Louis was accompanied by the young William Clito himself, heir Robert Curthose. The French force was divided into 3 lines, with Louis commanding the rear. Interestingly, much like at Tinchebray, Henry did have a slight advantage over his opponent, but instead of relying on this alone, ordered most of his men to dismount and form a tight defensive line between the farmstead and the thick wooded area nearby, which guarded his flanks. But Henry did retain a small vanguard of cavalry who remained rooted in the saddle. The battle began when Louis sent his first line of knights forward. These were met by Henry's vanguard of mounted knights. This melee saw the Norman side fall back under the pressure, emboldening Louis's knights to renew their assault on Henry's main line of dismounted troops. This time, however, they met with little success, as, much like at Tinchebray, Henry's knights resisted the charge doggedly, unhorsing, capturing many enemy knights in the process. Seeing this defeat, the French knight ordered his second line forward, which was once again met by Henry's battered vanguard. This time, however, not only were the knights defeated, but they were also shattered and dispersed, leaving Henry's main force to face the renewed assault of the reforming French knights. This second charge was noticeably more ferocious than the first. However, Henry's tight command and the character of his own men shine through, with his infantry holding firm and slowly gaining the upper hand over their French foes. It was now that Louis, perhaps shaken by the defeat of around a third of his forces, chose to withdraw the remainder. The Norman casualties were small, with only a reported 3 losses compared to the 140 French knights, which stacked up a hefty slew of ransoms for the Norman contingent. What's more, Louis eventually settled with Henry on the issue of the ducal succession, having his son, William Atheling, recognised by Louis as the heir to the duchy. Now, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, Henry could finally say he had the dynastic succession settled for all time. His son William, who embodied the bloodlines of both the houses of Normandy and Wessex, would inherit both the kingdom and the duchy held by his illustrious father. However, sadly for Henry, this was not to be, as disaster would dispel this fondly held hope on the rocks just outside of Barfleur harbour. William Atheling was trained from a very young age to be king, probably schooled by Queen Matilda herself or within her household, before graduating, as with all highborn sons, to the more manly arts, military doctrine, martial arts, as well as politics and governance. By 1113, young William was already entering into the public sphere, attesting royal documents. At around 12 years of age in 1115, he received the homage of the Norman barons in the duchy, and then for England itself in March of 1116. Following the death of his mother in 1118, he was even named Henry's regent when his father ventured into Normandy. William was even proving useful in securing Henry's border through his betrothal to the daughter of Count Fulk of Anjou, whom he married in the June of 1119. Yet despite the fact that Henry was fertile and productive, these overactive loins producing an abundance of bastard children, he only sired 2 legitimate offspring with the Queen, a boy and a girl. The girl would become immensely important in time, as we shall see, but it was on the boy that the hopes of this new Anglo-Norman dynasty hung. It was November 25th, 1120, some 2 decades into his reign. Henry was in Barfleur, along with a large section of his household, as well as many English and Norman nobles. It was afternoon, and he was awaiting the tide, when a certain Thomas Fitzstephen approached the king to offer passage in his own vessel, the White Ship. Thomas, perhaps in an effort to ingratiate himself in Henry's favour, even claimed that his own father had piloted Henry's father, William the Conqueror himself, 1066. Despite this fanciful claim, however, King Henry declined, though he was certainly impressed enough to allow Fitzstephen to pilot many others to England in his new ship, including his son William and much of the cream of the young Anglo-Norman nobility. Originally, the young Stephen of Blois, younger son of Theobald, Count of Blois, intended to board the White Ship, but, crucially, decided to wait for another vessel because of an upset tummy. Orderic Vitalis has it that Stephen disembarked due to the rowdiness of the passengers, but whatever the case, this was an extremely lucky turn of events that would prove disastrous in the long term for the peace and stability of England. The rowdy atmosphere was only exacerbated by William himself, when the prince brought aboard a liberal supply of wine, which he dispensed to both crew and passengers. Events further conspired against William and his companions, given it was a moonless night with very little wind. Now behind the king's vessel, with an inebriated crew, perhaps eager to impress their rowdy and high-born passengers, the sleek and swift ship raced out of harbour in an attempt to catch, overtake, and beat the rest of the party back to England. Alas, they did not get far, as the vessel smashed into a well-known rock, which loomed just under the water's surface. Cold sea water gushed into the ship, rapidly capsizing it, with all the women certainly doomed to frozen, watery deaths, given their thick, heavy dresses. The men may have fared somewhat better to begin with, however sadly, they were too far out to swim back to shore, and yet close enough that their screams could be made out to the horrified onlookers back ashore. Onlooker is a generous description, given it is highly unlikely anybody was spotted, with only the terrible cries and faint thrashing of desperation cutting the cold, chill night air. In the event, just one man survived, a butcher from Rouen called Berold, who somehow managed to cling on to some wreckage through the night. It was possibly Berold who later reported the fate of the young prince himself. William had managed to get into a small boat, only to be overwhelmed and dragged under the waves by the weight of desperate survivors when he tried to wade back to save his drowning half-sister. Another probable apocryphal tale is that the White Ship's captain initially survived, though chose to sink to his death on learning that William Atheling had perished, rather than face the wrath of King Henry. If true, it was probably a wise decision. Henry had landed safely in Southampton, and made his way to Clarendon to await his son. Nobody dared to face the king with the news, until Theobald of Blois had an innocent young boy fall before the king and deliver the news, weeping, who, as a blameless child, would surely not suffer the king's wrath. Alderic Vitalis writes that Henry fell to the ground upon receiving the news, and was, quote, conducted to his chamber, where he gave free course to his bitterness and grief, end quote. A much later poem by Felicia Hemans, He Never Smiled Again, probably encapsulates Henry's likely depression, not only the loss of his only legitimate son and heir, but also of his hopes for a clear and sure path to dynastic security. Whether or not Henry truly never smiled again hardly mattered in the long term, as now his carefully laid out plans for a peaceful succession were most decidedly in tatters. With no other legitimate heirs and his queen dead, Henry was forced to compromise his dream of an Anglo-Norman dynasty, acting quickly to marry again, though not to a woman of the old Anglo-Saxon bloodline. Henry married the young and beautiful Adeliza of Louvain in January of 1121, though remarkably, given the fertility of both husband and wife, no children would come from the marriage. Henry, though, could not have known this at the time. In 1121 he was around 52 years old. However, his new wife was just 18 and more than capable, in theory, of producing a new legitimate son. Henry was not delusional, though, and began to make plans for the worst. He did have another legitimate child, though questions immediately arose about whether a woman, even the daughter of a king and an empress, could or should rule a kingdom in her own right. If there was a woman who could, though, then it was Matilda. Born in 1102 as Henry's eldest child, Matilda was valuable as a key piece in her father's initial strategy for legitimising his own position. Negotiations of her marriage to Henry V, the future Holy Roman Emperor, resulted in a diplomatic triumph in 1110, when Henry's daughter was crowned 25th of July in Mantes. Matilda was just 8 years old, but the match did much to elevate Henry's prestige at home and abroad. In January of 1114, Matilda officially married King Henry V, her own rank raised to dizzying heights as the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1117, she even accompanied her husband into Rome itself, being crowned by the disputed Pope Gregory VIII. Matilda would use the title Empress consistently for the rest of her life, and was placed in northern Italy at the time to govern the region in her husband's name throughout 1118. This information is crucial in understanding the character of this remarkable woman. She had been educated in the German culture of rule as a young girl, and gained practical experience ruling subjects directly in this period. Much like her father's second childless marriage, however, Matilda was not destined to birth the Emperor's heirs, though she was clearly capable given the later birth of her own 3 sons. In 1125, Emperor Henry died, throwing open this unorthodox solution to the widowed Empress's father, King Henry. After 4 years of marriage, the king had failed to sire a legitimate heir with Adeliza, and may have begun to consider male relatives, such as Stephen of Blois, the son of his sister Adeliza, as potential successors. He and Adeliza were close in age, and likely closer than the king had been with his brothers. Stephen was no doubt a favourite of the king, with Henry arranging a good marriage for him with Matilda, Countess of Boulogne, another decision that would prove decisive in the aftermath of his death. Theobald, Count of Blois, also lived and was an elder brother of Stephen, though he became Count of Champagne in 1125. If Henry considered either of these men, then he did not follow through on actually publicly designating either as his heir. Another obvious alternative was Robert of Gloucester, King Henry's most prominent, illegitimate son, who held extensive lands in both Normandy and England. Robert was a powerful magnate and was favoured perhaps on a par with his cousin Stephen, the legitimate nephew of the king. Robert had plenty of support, though, despite the fact that his grandfather, William the Conqueror himself, was a bastard, attitudes towards bastard inheritance had hardened and his succession would scarcely have ensured a peaceful realm if more legitimate contenders violently disagreed with Henry's decision. Before 1128, Henry had the uncomfortable option of William Clito, his nephew, and the incarcerated former Duke Robert's legitimate son, though for obvious reasons this would be awkward and difficult to implement and was not a serious option. The returning Matilda arguably had one of the best claims to her father's crown. She was his only surviving legitimate child, carrying the all-important blood of the ancient House of Wessex, which flowed through her veins. Like Henry himself, she could also claim legitimacy through porphyrogeniture, or being born to the purple, that is, being born to the reigning monarch. Matilda had been born after Henry became king, just as Henry had been born after his father's conquest of England, unlike his older brothers. Furthermore, Henry seemingly sealed the deal on January 1st, 1127, the gathering of his barons in London, following his Christmas court at Windsor. In attendance were King Henry, his new queen, still childless, and Matilda herself. One by one the key players filed in front of them to swear to uphold Matilda's succession. Among these men were William of Corbel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who would presumably have the job of crowning Matilda when the time came. In addition, the King of Scots added his personal pledge, and he would later indeed prove to be a staunch supporter. Next to swear, and arguably the most important, was Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, the king's favourite. First to swear among the lay nobility, it is undeniable that Stephen, who had narrowly escaped sharing William Atheling's watery death in 1120, did pledge to uphold his royal cousin's path to the crown and her father's duchy. Unlike Matilda, Stephen was not officially designated his uncle's heir, had other claimants above him, including his own brothers Theobald and the disabled William. He was not born to the purple and was not directly descended through a male line, which made him a distant prospect for his royal uncle. Despite all this, however, Stephen did have something going for him: his sex. In a world in which men ruled through military might, he was powerful, the Count of Boulogne, and had extensive landholdings in England. He was also popular and affable enough to make him a decent political operator. What's more, he did have a decent claim to the crown through his mother, and was, unlike Robert of Gloucester, King Henry's eldest son, legitimate. With this public designation of Matilda as his heir, King Henry may have uneasily breathed a sigh of relief. His heir's tragic death had done more damage than merely scuppering the succession, and Matilda would also prove useful in repairing his collapsing relations with the Angevins to the south of Normandy. William's marriage to Fulk, the Count of Anjou's daughter, obviously fell through, but in 1127 Henry arranged for the 26-year-old former Holy Roman Empress Matilda to marry Fulk's 15-year-old son, Geoffrey the Fair. This was an obvious major fall from grace for Henry's proud and politically experienced daughter. She would now marry, in 1128, the son of a count, when she had been the empress of an empire. She now went from ruling in her former husband's name to being the wife of a teenaged and inexperienced and relatively minor noble. Not surprisingly, the marriage was rocky. Within a year, Matilda returned to Normandy, to her father's displeasure. Yet even with this rocky start, the marriage of Geoffrey and Matilda would ultimately prove successful, the two forging a cordial, if strained, business-like relationship centered around their sons. 1129 saw Henry's primary threat in that region, Fulk, leave to take up the title, King of Jerusalem, naming his younger son, Henry's own son-in-law, Count of both Maine and Anjou. The couple were reconciled in 1131, though the possession of particular castles in the south of Normandy, which the king had promised them as dowry for Matilda, were not handed over, causing tension in both the marriage itself and between them and Henry. Matilda may have been worried that her position as heir was undermined by a position so far south if her father should die. If this was a concern, then it was well founded. To the pleasure and relief of Henry, Matilda gave birth to two sons in 1133 and 1134, with a third coming later, thus providing potential legitimate heirs to the kingdom, though by the birth of Henry in 1133, his grandfather was 64 years old. In 1135, relations between Henry, his daughter, and Geoffrey deteriorated, given Matilda and Geoffrey's lack of support in England and lack of a firm base in Normandy. Having their request for castles to be handed over to them while the king lived, and homage sworn to Matilda by the Norman nobles, angrily rejected by the old king, given Henry's fears that Geoffrey would simply take power in the duchy. A rebellion sparked in southern Normandy, led by William, Count of Ponthieu, and supported by the disgruntled Angevin couple. Henry was vigorous in stamping out this new threat, despite his advanced years, strengthening the southern frontier. However, ironically, on a hunting trip, given his own brother's death, Henry suddenly fell ill. According to Henry of Huntingdon, he ate too much, specifically an eel-like fish called a lamprey, against his doctor's advice. His condition was soon shown to be terminal, with Henry taking confession and being comforted by Robert of Gloucester and other members of the royal court. Henry I died on December 1st, 1135. His body was removed to Rouen, where his entrails were buried and the corpse was embalmed. Henry was finally laid to rest in Reading Abbey in England. Henry I, youngest son of King William the Conqueror, and arguably the greatest of the Norman monarchs, was dead. Despite all his efforts to avoid it, he left his kingdom in limbo, the crown in dispute, as throughout December barons in Normandy gradually agreed that Theobald, Count of Blois and Champagne, should succeed as the elder male relative and a grandson of William the Conqueror. Matilda, Henry's actual designated heir, could not have been in a worse position to claim her father's crown. She was technically in rebellion against her father at the time of his death. She was heavily pregnant, was firmly an Angevin through her marriage to Geoffrey, which thus opened the possibility, however slim, that an Angevin would succeed to the throne and duchy of the Anglo-Norman world. Given Anjou and Normandy were traditional rivals, this prospect did not fill the Norman barons with joy. More obviously was that Matilda was a woman. Could she rule men, lead men in battle, or effectively defend the realm? Worse still, Matilda was located much further south than her potential rivals. But if the barons in Normandy expected a long journey to England to crown their man, they were surprised when news reached them in later December that another claimed the crown. Fortuitously for Stephen, not only did he have enough support and a claim to the throne through his grandfather, but he was also informed of his uncle's death first in his seat of Boulogne, much earlier than Henry's actual heir Matilda, who was with her husband Geoffrey in Anjou further south. Like Henry before him, Stephen was in a prime location to capitalise on the confusion of the succession, and move swiftly he did, with Boulogne being close to England. He landed in Dover around 5th of December and quickly moved to London, arriving around the 8th of December, just a week after the old king's death. The Londoners were particularly amenable to Stephen given his position as Count of Boulogne. He controlled the all-important trade route to the continent, and was also accompanied by an armed contingent to concentrate minds further. The stars further aligned in Stephen's favour, given he then rode for Winchester to take the royal treasury, the city conveniently under the control of his younger brother, the Bishop Henry of Blois. Despite some initial objections from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen and his supporters ultimately proved persuasive, with the ironical argument that the peace and stability of the realm took precedence over any oaths previously taken. So it was that Stephen of Blois was crowned King Stephen of England at a hastily arranged and sparsely attended ceremony at Westminster on December 22nd, 1135. However, though a coronation went a long way to solidifying Stephen's claim to the throne of England, the matter was far from closed, as across the Channel brooded Stephen's greatest rival in Matilda, former Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, and true heir to her father's crown. The subsequent civil war, known to history as the Anarchy, would see this indomitable woman press her claim to the very cusp of power. In 1141, her supporters defeated Stephen at Lincoln. but her later haughty attitude and demand for a heavy tax in London caused the residents to kick her out on the eve of her own coronation. She carried on the war to oust Stephen throughout the 1140s, even capturing the usurper for a time, but being forced to exchange him for Robert, Earl of Gloucester, following her own defeat in the rout of Winchester. In 1148, following the death of her chief supporter, Robert of Gloucester, she was forced to accept that she would never personally sit on the throne of England, as her father had intended, yet threw her support behind her eldest son and the grandson of Henry, Henry Plantagenet. By 1153, the young Henry had risen to mastery of both Normandy, Anjou, and then through marriage, lordship over more of France than the King of France himself. An agreement hammered out with the exhausted King Stephen guaranteed he would succeed him. Henry did not wait long, with Stephen himself expiring the next year. So it was that in 1154, nearly 2 decades after his grandfather's death, Henry's namesake was crowned King Henry II, the first king of the long-ruling Plantagenet dynasty, yet the legitimate grandson of the great Norman monarch, and also through his mother, the descendant of both the Norman kings and the old House of Wessex, just as Henry had always wanted. King Henry I was undoubtedly a great king, arguably the greatest of the 4 Norman monarchs. Though this accolade could be claimed by his much more famous father, Henry built on and improved on the Conqueror's reign, doing much to unify the English and Norman peoples through his policies and marriage. Though it is undeniable that Henry's greatest failure had been his leaving England's crown in dispute, a reality he must have been acutely aware of. Despite this, and the subsequent years of civil war over his legacy, Henry still deserves to be remembered as one of England's great kings.